after the hour. So Madison started recording. I'm going to backtrack the slides by 2, and Kelly's going to kick us off.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us on your lunch hour for this sort of AIA 2030 COTE presentation refresher on the 2030 commitment, as well as some updates that we have through gaining some data through member surveys on kind of where the chapter is at in comparison to national data. So Daniel and I will be going through that towards the end of the presentation. So first want to just say quickly, housekeeping stuff. If you could make sure that your name in the Zoom actually is your full first and last name to assure that you get CEU credit. So just make that change now in Zoom. Also want to say that you can use the chat throughout to kind of chat with each other or make comments, but that we'll be using the Q&A at the end of the presentation for formal questions. So if you want to submit a question, I suggest you put it there and not put it in the chat. All right, so with that, first we want to thank our COTE and 2030 commitment sponsors, Skyline Design and Rockwool. Without them, we couldn't be putting on programming throughout the year specific to the COTE 2030 initiatives. And also want to thank our sponsors, our 1869 Circle partners. These are people or entities that are, huge supporters of AIA Chicago and help make programming happen throughout the year. So big thanks to them as they're really great partners to all things that happen at AIA Chicago, including programming for this knowledge community. Also quickly want to shout out to AIA Chicago in general, all the support that our knowledge community gets specifically from people like Madison Young, who help keep us organized and put on webinars like this so that you all can get the most up-to-date information from our group. So thank you so much to them. Just want to flash this slide for our knowledge community splash page. This is found on AIA Chicago's website. I encourage you to check it out. This has not only events that are associated with this KC, but also resources so you can stay engaged. And I think we're going to be providing this presentation on the page as well so that you can refer to it later. So you'll be able to find it there. If you want to receive any updates or event information directly, I encourage you to enter your name and email as shown here on this page so that we can make sure you're included on all future things 2030 and COTE. So our group is led by 3 co-chairs, myself and Daniel. David Swain could not be here with us today, is also a very active co-chair. We've been doing this together for the past 2 years when 2030 and COTE were formally fused. And I think it's been a really great marriage of those 2 KCs because they are inherently linked. Our goals that are listed here are also tied to the national goals for COTE. And so you can read them here, but we collaborate, we enable transformation, we chronicle design excellence, we advocate for change, and we want to strengthen our network. So all of our programming and initiatives that we put forward sort of are guided by these goals. Upcoming programming for this year that's already on the books, we've kind of divided into 4 subcategories to make sure that we're hitting all of these things as we're thinking about resources and engagement opportunities for our members. And those are grouped into policy and legislation, climate justice and social equity, decarbonization, and the 2030 commitment. So what you see here are the current programs that are being planned throughout the year that fit into these buckets. So again, I encourage you to keep the lookout for those events and sign up to attend or participate, as well as, we're always looking for fresh ideas to add more opportunities for connections. So if you have them, please reach out directly to any of the co-chairs and or join the committee itself or the knowledge community itself, which you can do on the website. So a quick intro to what the 2030 commitment is. I'm sure a lot of you on this call already are familiar, but just want to give a quick refresher because we like to do this every year in advance of the 2030 DDX reporting deadline, which is March 31st. So I'm going to give just kind of a quick high-level overview of what this is. And so the mission of the AIA 2030 commitment is to transform the practice of architecture in a way that is holistic, firm-wide, project-based, and data-driven. And so really what this means is, as an incremental time periods of 5 years towards 2030, we're constantly pushing for more focus on reducing fossil fuel consumption and pivoting more towards renewable energy. And so through the DDX reporting, looking at how we're designing buildings to continue to use strategies that are towards that effort, with the idea that we could be carbon neutral by 2030, which is quickly approaching. So why is this important? We could give a whole talk just on this, right? But I think it kind of goes without saying that we're hearing more and more every day about how the climate crisis is looming, is here. And our interactions with of how we can be a solution are based in how we perform as architects and the design of our buildings. And so that is, it's of utmost importance. I don't even really want to get into all the reasons why, but it's pivotal in our profession that we are leaders in this effort, because it is continuing to accelerate. And so if we're not pushing for it, we need to be those advocates for the change. So the impact of buildings, these are statistics that are thrown around a lot, but are very important to point out. Building operations are responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and embodied carbon emissions, 11% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So more to the point that our role as architects, designers, or people in the AEC field have a lot of power to making change in this, in that if we are intentionally making these efforts to reduce energy consumption or fossil fuel dependency, that we can actually make very, very impactful change when it comes to the global CO2 emissions. So how that transitions to our role as architects, designers, engineers. So design strategies that have the greatest impact on building energy use. We can do all kinds of things, and of them, there's a few listed here. Adapt or renovate buildings instead of tearing them down and saving that embodied carbon. We can certainly design for extremely high performance and resilience through our envelope choices, our orientation, things like that, that minimize the dependence on MEP systems. We can choose to and push for energy modeling of everything, so that we actually are testing these things against realities and making adjustments in the design process early and often, so that we're really optimizing everything to make sure that we're using as little energy as possible. We can use salvage materials instead of virgin materials, really thinking about where do our materials come from, because that has embodied carbon attached to that. And so where can we use things that already exist, or at least be thinking about where they come from as far as like what's that radius. We can make those decisions in our specifications. Thinking about only using potable water for drinking, and instead using captured water or reused water for other water uses in our buildings. And then use lower embodied carbon materials and materials that sequester CO2. Again, these are choices we can make even if a client isn't demanding them. So they could become kind of a part of your practice, and when you're thinking about picking materials or picking envelope assemblies, things like that. You don't necessarily need to be told to do this. These are already things we know how to do and have resources for. A lot of people always want to know, well, how do I sell this to a client to get them to care or get them to pay for things like energy modeling? And a few things that come to mind that can be talking points to help bring them on board. One is resilience. Obviously, in the previous slide, you're showing all these natural disasters and things that are happening. Climate fluctuations are spiking up, down, all around, and how that impacts our buildings and them being able to be durable, low maintenance, things like that. we have to be thinking about, what choices we can make in regards to resiliency, ESG, or environmental, social, corporate governance. This is a term that is talked about in businesses, that is sort of a set of considerations that's a holistic view on sustainability and how they operate their business or investment choices that they make. Certainly, you can talk about energy savings, which are cost savings. Dollars are always easy selling points when talking about return on investment. Also, market innovation, thinking about how can clients be ahead of the game or be first at things that they can sort of talk about as being innovators themselves. And then as well as awards and attention. Everybody wants their projects to be notable and marketable as far as like, hey, it won these awards. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that is impacted with the 2030 participation. So AIA Chicago has been making changes over the last couple of years to the Design Excellence Awards that are tied to all of these things. And so as of last year, and I think these are subject to change this year, but I think they'll probably be around these same requirements, but all firms submitting for Design Excellence Awards will have to have signed on to the 2030 commitment. And so you'll have to, say that that's something that you did, register your firm through to the DDX, and really be able to show that you're participating in that. You're also going to be required to have up-to-date project reporting to the firm portfolio in the DDX at the time of the submission. It's suggested but not required that the project that you're submitting for the award is part of that portfolio. Ideally, you should have all of your projects as part of your portfolio. So hopefully this shouldn't really be a hurdle too high. And then also, if you're planning on submitting for the decarbonization award, which highlights, high performance buildings in the spirit of energy savings and decarbonization, you must submit that project to your DDX portfolio in order to be considered. So let's take a step back and sort of talk a little bit about what the metrics are when we're thinking about 2030 reporting and the DDX. And what those targets are towards the commitment. So first terminology we'll talk about is energy use intensity, EUI. So this is measured in kBTUs per square foot per year. So this is talking about how much energy use the building is using per square foot, and lighting power density. So that's measured in watts per square foot. Those are kind of the big measurement points when reporting your data for your projects in the DDX. So how that translates into the 2030 commitment for new buildings and renovation, like I said, each 5-year increment, we're sort of pushing further and further of how much we need to be below baseline. And right now we're in that 2020 to 2024 increment, which is an 80% reduction below baseline. And again, we're all doing this as incremental change, working towards net zero carbon emissions by 2030. And that's for all new buildings and renovations. For interior projects, the main data point that is submitted is lighting power density must be 25% below baseline. So the steps to participating in the 2030 commitment and reporting in DDX. So first and foremost, you have to set your energy reduction goal at the project concept stage. The earlier you do this, the better. You can certainly use the AIA DDX to find the goal based on your use type to set that reduction goal. And then the idea is that the earlier you do that, that's kind of your target that you're working towards, and that you design to reduce that energy usage throughout the phases of design, and keep using that tool as a checkpoint. And so how you do that is you start with early site analysis when you're thinking about orientation and exposure, and massing. You then can model and document the predicted EUI at each phase milestone so that you're sort of tracking the progress and the design decisions that you're making. Throughout, you're developing strategies to hit those goals of the reduced predicted EUI or LPD. And then the goal is that at the end of every year, you're reporting kind of where you're at in that process with the data in the DDX. And this is all in the spirit of transparency and tracking progress. It's not a punishment if you're not hitting things, but if you're not doing this on a regular basis, you're not really going to be able to make corrective changes in ways that are implementable through the design process. So how you determine the predicted energy use. First, you kind of can start with what is the code equivalency based on your building type. This is something you can, again, find in the DDX to set that. Certainly, we always recommend any energy modeling, but at the very least, early energy analysis, sort of a shoebox model that can look at, again, like orientation and exposure and sort of where, how the building should be formulated and when you're starting to think about your envelope and systems. To take it a step further, while full energy modeling is not required, it's always encouraged because, again, how are you able to prove that the decisions that you're making are going to be effective? So doing that early and often throughout the design process is encouraged to be checking against that predicted EUI. And we certainly don't want to exclude or forget about our engineering partners in this effort. And so while a lot of architects can do this energy modeling themselves, sometimes that's done by your engineering consultant or partner. But either way, whoever's doing the modeling, you still want to be engaging the engineers throughout because they can also help influence the choices that are made as far as the system selection, sizing, and so that kind of it's an integrative design process between both disciplines. Methods of reporting in the DDX, you can use the DDX website and platform directly and kind of go project by project and enter all the information. You can also do a bulk upload with a spreadsheet that sort of is all your projects with all the information at once, or an API link from energy modeling tools such as Insight 360, Code Tool, etc. I think the next couple slides is sort of giving you some visual snapshots of what this interface looks like and how you engage with it. So these are direct snapshots from the DDX itself. This is the kind of homepage you get when you open up your portfolio, which is a summary of all of your projects, their status of where they are as far as like, are they active, closed, completed, on hold, what type of project they are. You can organize by studio or office if you have multiple offices in your firm or multiple studios, if you want to sort that way. And you can see along the bottom there, all the other data points that you're recording as you move through the design process. This is sort of a snapshot of everything. Moving forward, this is as you open one project and begin kind of what you need to enter in: project name, basic project information. A lot of these data points that you're entering in as far as construction type, location, climate zone, things like that, also helps you track it, but it's also more information for AIA 2030 to be compiling on a nationwide scale for like when they're thinking about how much square footage or building typologies are doing better or worse than others. So it's important that you fill this out best you can specific to your project. Other data points you're talking about is estimated occupancy here, the energy code that applies to this building based on its location, and then, costs associated with that. Again, those are sort of just metrics that are used to track how much square footage or construction costs is being modeled or considered when reporting against the 2030 commitment. Down at the bottom here is where you see the baseline energy use. So that again is set by, you can enter it in by use type. So if it's an office building and the square footage, you enter that in that middle section there. If it's a kind of multi-purpose building or has multiple use types, you can enter them in and their associated square footage. And then this does a calculation of what the baseline EUI should be based on those use types. Or you can set your own custom baseline EUI, and that might be impacted by just a project goal or something specific to that project and its locale, etc. So that's where you set your baseline. Then it's like, what is the target for what your reduction is? And so again, it's going to do an automatic reduction calculation based on the use type and the 80% reduction target that we're doing just as part of the 2030 commitment, or again, you can set your own unique target to track against. And then as you enter all of this information project by project, it starts to summarize all of your project data across all of your projects for your whole portfolio into some of these tracking metrics, so you can kind of see how you're doing as a firm, as far as like how much of your projects are you energy modeling, how much are you actually reducing below baseline, are you reporting your embodied carbon, things like that. And so this is sort of a nice snapshot to be checking against, and can be used as conversation tools in your office of like how well you're doing throughout the year. And we encourage that you don't wait till you just submit everything at the end and then say, oh, how did we do? But this can be something that, again, is a way to influence change in your office throughout the year. So 5 general tips for meeting the commitment. While this is it is a challenge, and 80% below baseline is nothing to scoff at, is certainly possible. And we believe, as part of the 2030 COTE KC, that not only do we already have the resources and tools to do this, but these can actually be and should be a fun part of design. And so really connecting the idea of high performance buildings, energy reduction, embodied carbon reduction, and tying that to what is good design and design excellence. And that's happening not only in the requirements to submit for actual awards, but also like culturally within your firms, like what do we decide is good? And I think we should be having the conversations that tie what is good to what performs well and what is actually tackling the climate crisis. And we do that through empowering our project teams, whether you're in leadership at your firm, or even if you're, a project architect, architectural designer, that you're encouraging these conversations to be happening throughout the design process and using these tools to check against, and making space and time to do so. You can also invest in people, make sure that they have the resources, softwares, access to, trainings or webinars such as this one to get information, and really encouraging them to keep developing those skills. Supporting an integrated design process, again, like engaging with your engineers, your client contractors, even if you can, to make sure you're getting all the voices heard early and often throughout the design, so that the choices that you make are always moving towards a singular goal of that 80% or more reduction below baseline. And then promoting transparency, being honest with, where you're at and the where you've been, where you're at, and where you're going. And you do that through having data. And so that's the whole spirit of the 2030 commitment and the DDX, is that you have something to be looking at and be transparent about, so that you can continue to make or choose to make better choices that work towards the 2030 goals. And I think this is where I turn it over to Daniel.
So speaking of data, Kelly, so now this is our data wonk portion of our presentation. So it's going to be a lot of data. We are recording this, so don't worry about scribbling down notes. First, a reminder that, for those who might be newer to 2030, it's like your taxes. You always report it a year behind, right? So the data that we're looking at right now is 2022 data that all of these firms reported by March 31st of 2023, right? And 2 months from now, on March 31st of this year, we'll be reporting the 2023 data. The left pane in gray is data that we've pulled from the AIA by the numbers report, which is publicly available on AIA's website and is all of the 2030 signatories. And then the gold pane on the right is AIA Chicago land firms that we pulled from a survey that we sent out that 39 firms were kind enough to respond to. So and the other caveat here, right, is data is only as good as its data hygiene. This is all self-reported data, right? There could be errors. If there are errors, you hope they're not of a big order of magnitude. But when we look at some of the results and they seem a little bit strange or ponderous, we have to wonder, do we need to improve our data hygiene, right? And that's something we all need to work on. So the 2030 signatories, for this set of data, they reported about almost a little over 23,000 projects, right? That was up a little bit from the year before. how many firms are signed on. Currently, there's this last year, right? 428 firms signed on, slightly up from 417. I think I heard a statistic on an AI National call this week that there's something like 39,000 AE firms that are members of AIA. So our representation here, as you can see, is kind of abysmally low. As Kelly mentioned, the data set is divided into whole building projects and interior only projects, and they track a lot more metrics on whole building projects, right? And actually, before I get into that, I think I'm going to go back and forth between national data and Chicagoland data, so we can align from left to right on these charts, right? So according to AIA's website, there are 156 firms in the state of Illinois that are signatories. They don't let you resolve it by city, but I mean, we can probably imagine that a bulk of those 156 firms have a presence in Chicago or Chicagoland. So that's why I'm calling this Chicagoland data. Out of that 156, and using a database, we reached out to over 100 firms with the survey multiple times. We only got 39 responses, so thanks to those who did respond. And out of those 39 responses, 31 reported in 2023. Part of the reason we look at that is, it's not enough to just be committed. Once you're committed, you should be reporting. But we did ask reporting reasons, and a lot of those were valid reasons, like, there were no projects in design for that year for that firm, right? Or that firm was transitioning to a new structure, merging with somebody else. So it's not necessarily a naughty list, but just so you know, our data is based on 31 firms. So the whole building project average energy use reduction by predicted EUI for all of the firms reporting to 2030 was 48%. And for the firms that responded to the Chicagoland survey, it was slightly lower. But statistic, margin of error, you'd say we're about in the same spot. Let's remind ourselves the goal is 80%. So nobody's really doing great with this, right? And this is based on gross square footage, right? So there are projects that are doing much better, but if you're trying to gauge impact, right, it's all about gross square footage. The other thing you'll note is the whole notion of code equivalency. If you don't energy model, then you only get credit for code equivalency, even if your project might be better. So, the most stringent code in force in the country right now, that's not optional, is Title 24 in California, 2022 version. Code equivalency there is 60%. So that's still 20% below the 80% goal. And then, in Chicagoland, right, IECC 2021, I think the code equivalency there is something like 57, 58%, right? So obviously designing to be code compliant or slightly better than code is not going to get us to net zero, right? So let's look at the percentage of the whole portfolio of submitted projects that actually met the 80% goal. So nationwide, it was 4%. In the Chicagoland data, it was 7%. So actually, our firms seem to be doing a little bit better. And I think, the data is anonymous, but, knowing that there are a few firms that reported that really specialize in passive house and net zero, I think we probably have some really special projects that are bringing up our average. And that's awesome that we have those special projects in our area, but we want to try to get that secret sauce and expand it to a larger percent of the portfolio. So in the nationwide data, 19 firms were able to say they met the 80% across their whole portfolio. Now, again, we don't have any data on how many projects that means, the size of those firms, right? So it could be a firm that's only doing a handful of boutique projects, but still it's an accomplishment to say your firm met it across the whole portfolio. So 19 firms nationwide, 3 firms in our Chicagoland data met it across their whole portfolio. Nationwide, 346 projects are being modeled and predicted to be net zero. We did not ask that question on our survey, but I think we know from other programming we've seen in AIA that there are, and Illinois Green, that there are several net zero projects in the works right now in Chicagoland, and some already certified. So that's good to know. And then energy modeling, 62% were energy modeled across everybody's portfolio, only 55% in our data. So our data is lagging a little bit behind that. It's still not a bad number, but we want to see that number to go up. And then interior only projects. This is something where we can criticize the AIA 2030 program, because with LED lighting, 25% reduction in LPD is not hard, right? Maybe in some really intensive manufacturing or surgical program type, but in general, should not be that hard to get to 25% LPD reduction. 72% of the projects in the nationwide portfolio met that reduction. In our data, only 49% met that reduction. And again, the reduction shouldn't be that hard to do. So I think we need to look a little bit more closely. This is probably an area where we have erroneous reporting, and people are not really taking their LPD, let's say, from their ComCheck and accurately transferring it over to their 2030 submission. So that was sort of a broad overview. We're going to get a little deeper. Some of this is a little bit repetitive. It's meant to be that way since I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but also the graphics are helpful. So again, 3.8 billion gross square feet in the full portfolio, and 395.5 million of that is attributed to our firms here, right? Our Chicagoland firms. Again, you could see that average reduction so our gross square footage is the red line, sort of estimated on the blue bar of total square footage on the right hand part of this graph. And then our percentage in the yellow line is slightly below the national percentage in green, right? And by the way, the 346 net zero projects were reported by 135 firms. So some of the firms have more than one, you can see. Let's go to interior only, right? It was 411 million gross square feet. Of that, 21.1 million is ours. Again, average 32% reduction, and our average reduction was only 26, and 72% of the total square footage met the target, and for us, it was only 49. And you can see those lines on this graph. So let's talk about energy modeling. So again, see 62% of the project square footage nationally was energy modeled, only 55% in Chicagoland. And then this chart on the right is an interesting one, and it goes to data hygiene, right? So the green line are modeled projects, the blue line are non-modeled projects. What you're hoping to see when you analyze this data is that modeled projects do a lot better. And I can tell you from my own internal analysis, my firm is only modeling about 20% of our projects. Our average energy reduction on that 20% is like 65, and our average energy reduction on non-modeled is like 42, right? So that's kind of what you expect to see, that energy modeling drives performance. This national data last year is kind of off because it doesn't look like that's really the case, right? There's only a 3% difference between energy model projects versus non-energy model projects. And so I've sat on some 2030 national calls where this has been discussed, and the leading theory is that people are thinking that people are energy modeling too late, right? So we're telling you to energy model and energy model more, but we really should be saying early, right? Because energy modeling at the end of construction documents or at 50% CD, just in order to see what your energy use is or predicted energy use is, that's useful as a data point, but it doesn't inform design, right? By 50% CD, you're probably not going to change your mechanical system or your glazing or your orientation of your building, right, to make it more energy efficient. So we really want to emphasize the early shoebox comparing options energy modeling. And if people energy model early, I think we're going to see the energy performance go up. Now, we did not do any electrification poll questions in our local surveys. So here we're just looking at national data. But for those, who may not, and I know this is a smart group of people, so you probably all understand why electrification is an important conversation. But if you don't, the reason why, right, is because you can't get to net zero unless you have an all-electric building, because we can't compensate or offset for combustion emissions happening on a site, right? So once they're in the air, they're in the air, right? So as the grid in the country gets more renewable, right? And right now the statistic is 21.5% of the US grid is powered by clean electricity. Someday that's going to be 100%, hopefully sooner rather than later. And so if you have an all electric building, then you can take advantage of that, right? So this is some statistics. You can see that the number of, in the top right quadrant, the number of all electric buildings reported has been really jumping from 2020 to 2022. And then if you look at the graph below that, you can see, how that divides into how many were fully 100% electric, how many were mostly electric, right? Which probably means they've got a gas line for a commercial kitchen, or maybe they've got gas for domestic hot water, and then ones that are, 3/4 of the way electric. Out of the all electric buildings, 80.1 million gross square feet, or 2%, actually were reported to the level of detail of fuel sources. And that's important. We didn't show it when Kelly was showing the DDX slides, but going forward, starting this year, if you're going to say that your building is net zero, you have to report your data at the level of resolution of fuel sources. You can't just report your PUI, because you have to prove that you don't have any on-site combustion. And if you have on-site combustion, they're not going to call you net zero. So this is just another chart. This is specific to net zero national data. It's showing the number of net zero projects have really been climbing, right? I mean, a major increase, right, from 2018 to 2022. And you can see that the amount of projects that included renewable energy is also increasing pretty rapidly, right? Almost 2,000 projects, and over 335 million gross square footage. And so these are up quite a bit from last year. So this is definitely a trend that's getting traction. And if you're interested in understanding what the sources of renewable are, right, it's mostly photovoltaics, you could see on this graph, right? And if you're interested in knowing what kind of sectors this is happening in, you can see it's a lot in residential, right? Multifamily residential, and then single family residential. And then the next sector that's closest is education, and then office, right? So you can see things like retail, not so much, right? Mixed use for some reason, not so much. On the topic of impact, this is sort of the summary of the whole report from the national data, right? So the energy efficiency by the 2030 firms, right, is saving our clients 11.3 billion in the reporting year. It's a significant number. It's also saving, almost 42 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent from being emitted. So that's important to know, right? That's the whole point of this, right? And just in the bottom right quadrant, you'll see 168 new firms signed on to the commitment last year. So there are more and more firms becoming interested in this. Now, let's talk about embodied carbon again, because we've been talking mostly about avoiding emissions through energy savings. But when Kelly was talking about the design items, she did talk about embodied carbon, right? So embodied carbon is a reporting field that's still optional in the DDX. Someday in the near future, it will become required, but we're, seeing what are people doing with this so far, right? So 124 firms reported embodied carbon for at least one project. That jumped from 83 the year before. It was almost 4,000 projects, and that was 3 times what it was the year before. And those projects totaled 1.3 billion gross square footage, or 34% of the total portfolio reported. It's a 5-time increase from the year before. When you look at the Chicagoland firms, 13 firms reported embodied carbon. 3 of those firms reported embodied carbon on more than 50% of their portfolio, which is saying something. And our Chicagoland firm carbon study was worth 36 million gross square feet, or 9% of our total portfolio. And you can kind of see where that is on the chart. Now, for people who, may not have been doing this, or where this is coming from, I tell you that, like Living Building Challenge, for example, you have to model embodied carbon, right? In LEED, there are 5 points available if you model embodied carbon and prove reduction. So some of these projects that are doing it because they have these other certification goals. But to get to be net zero by 2030, we need to be starting to do this on all of our projects. And then this is a box and whiskers chart that shows you where those projects that model the embodied carbon sit. It's hard to conclude like where they should be sitting, right? Because the data sets, you can try looking at Carbon Leadership Forum, but the data sets are all over the place. So I don't know that we can make any conclusions from that. Just understand how it breaks down. 82% were new construction, 18% were major renovation. No, the structure of a building is where most of the embodied carbon is. So a major renovation is poised to actually have a lower embodied carbon than a new building, right? 97% of the stuff modeled was whole building projects. 3% were interior only, and they the data set represents a median embodied carbon of 550 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared, which is the bizarre metric unit that this stuff is measured in. And then let's look at tools. So just to let people understand, this goes back to data hygiene. I was on a national call. The Department of Energy was very unhappy that 3,000 people said their tool was other, because that doesn't help them invest in what tools they should be funding and supporting, right? So I believe other is not going to be a choice this year, or if it is, you're going to have to fill in what that tool was, right? A lot of people are using Build Carbon Neutral. Build Carbon Neutral is a very high-level website-based answer 6 questions, get an estimated embodied carbon. I think firms who are reporting across their whole portfolio are probably using that, and that's a great gateway into doing this. Anybody could do that. It's not as precise as doing a full LCA in Tally or using EC3, but it is a good gateway to getting to studying this kind of information. And then if we want to look at embodied carbon by use type, overwhelmingly office projects seem to be doing that. And I think that might be driven by ESG goals for major companies like corporate headquarters and things like that. And then you can see education kind of right behind. Again, other, which is not super useful, is the next statistic there. So, and you can see where, single family, residential, not maybe talking too much about embodied carbon yet, but soon enough we will be, right? Just to remind people, super high level embodied carbon reduction strategies, right? Figure out what the baseline is for your specific project. Start by reusing as much building infrastructure and material as you can. Optimize your structural design on the new stuff, right? If you have less structural steel, you have less embodied carbon. If your structural steel is more efficient, for example. Optimize your interiors, right? Can you do a sealed concrete floor and make it look beautiful, as opposed to taking another flooring material and putting it on top of it, right? That's a good example of that. Look at bio-based materials, right? Bio-based materials like responsibly managed wood, hemp, straw, those things actually sequester carbon dioxide as they grow, right? And so that's another good way. And then ultimately carbon offsets, right? Because you really can't, it should be the last thing we do, but you can't get to zero carbon without having offsets, right? Because, matter has carbon, right? So we're closing up here and we're going to leave some time for questions, just some FAQ, Mythbusters. Doing 2030 takes too much time. Honestly, if you do it as you're working through the projects, it really is not much extra. Typically, it takes less than 30 minutes to input the data into the DDX. That's assuming you don't have to go chasing people for the data, right? And it does make sense to have someone on the project team enter the data, as opposed to having one person across the firm do it for everybody's project, right? It's leaner to do it with the people on the team, and it's also more accurate, right? You worked on the project, you know what the data is, right? It requires too many resources. It's a free program. You get a lot of support, and peers share information. So you should leverage that, right? You have poor performing projects in your portfolio. Well, all the data is aggregated and it's all anonymous, right? And quite frankly, even though the point of this is to improve performance, right? You can't improve what you don't know. So if you don't calculate your portfolio because you think it's going to do poorly, then you're never going to make it better, right? You have to achieve the target. The commitment is not actually to achieve the target. It should be, but the commitment is to share the data and to strive to achieve the target, right? So that shouldn't be a barrier. And the project must be complete, not true, right? You want to look at this stuff early because you're trying to make your projects better. You're trying to inform design. You should start concept and you should monitor it all the way through. What to expect when you sign on. If there's anybody here who hasn't signed on yet and you're thinking about it, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to sign the commitment letter. You're going to create a sustainability action plan. There are templates actually available on the 2030 website from other firms, so you can use those as a quick start. You're going to report your projects by the 31st of March each year. You're going to try to work firm-wide to meet the targets. And as appropriate, maybe every 2 years, you're going to review and update your sustainability action plan. This really can help drive performance across firms. Now, this deck is going to be shared on our 2030 KC page. So these are all live links that you'll have access to. Once that's done, I think it'll probably take about a week. These are all live links to resources to improve energy performance, right? From the 2030 commitment webpage itself to Ed Mazaria's Architecture 2030, which is where this all started, Framework for Design Excellence, Zero Tool, New Buildings Institute, cool stuff here. And then other resources. So AIA National is giving a series of open office hours and presentations. The schedule is on the right. The last link on the bottom is how you sign up for them. So people who have international projects and are not sure how to do that next week, Valentine's Day bulk import, and then you can see leading right up to the deadline of March 31st. There's like Ask Us Anything. This is staffed by Melissa Moranci from AIA and a bunch of other, like I'm volunteering to present on the bulk import one. So people who are on these things can answer your questions and can help you, right? And then the data set that I referenced, the by the numbers report, is this first link. So you'll have that information once you get this slide deck. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to look at the Q&A.
Like we have 2 questions.
Yeah. Of the Chicago data received, did national and global firms provide data for their entire portfolio or just their Chicago offices? So that's a very good question. We did not specify that when we put out the survey, and we did get a couple people asking us what they wanted what we wanted them to do, right? I told them use your judgment. For like my firm has offices across the country. We are not operating on a city by city basis. We're operating by sectors. So I parsed our data firm wide, right? Not just Chicago projects. And I told people if that's easier for you to do it that way. But if, I think someone at one of the firms said they actually had a data set just for their Chicago projects, right? So that is another flaw potentially, right, in the data. And then someone asks, I wonder why percentage of project energy model has been going down over the past 3 years. Right. So that is a good question. And again, when we talked about this on the national working group, people are thinking that it's because we're pushing for energy modeling, but people are not getting the message that it should be early energy modeling, right? So they're energy modeling too late, right? And so when you energy model too late, your reported data is going to be better than code equivalent, but it's not going to be as good as if you energy modeled early enough to make your project better, right? Okay, so that was it in the Q&A. Let me go over to the chat, just see if anyone didn't follow the directions. Yeah, Scott was saying that AIA National could potentially help us have 2 data sets for Chicago based on zip code. Yeah, we can reach out and see. If they could help with that. I know we did the survey ourselves this year because we were told they were too busy to help us because they are, changing initiatives. So, but it's okay. Just go back. Doesn't look like there were any other. Oh, good point. When Kelly showed the slide for upcoming events, some of those events are going to be potential crossovers with some of the other KCs, right? Like the design KC and the technical issues KC. So stay tuned and look for those cross events because you can see that this is not something that should live in a silo, right? Because this is not just about 2030 data, right? It's about design and making everything better.
Yeah, in fact, we're trying to have as many cross-pollination events as possible, just because we think that the 2030 code conversation should be had in all of the KCs. So always looking for opportunities for collaboration in that way.
Right. Yep. So, someone said they just want to give kudos to the firm, those 3 firms that met the commitment across their portfolio. I'm going to preserve the anonymity, but yes, those firms definitely deserve kudos. If any of them are on and would like to put in the Q&A, yes, you could say it was us. That's fine. Otherwise, I promise anonymity. So let's see if there's any other questions. Oh, yes, Historic Resources would like to partner as well. And yes, I mean, think about it. Again, the embodied energy of an existing building, right, is huge, right? If you can retrofit that and adapt it, why tear it down, right? So yes, I mean, as much cross collaboration between KCs as possible. All right. Give last call for anybody to put questions in Q&A. If not, look out on the Casey website for the posting of this within a week. Your AIA information for the CU should automatically be reported, assuming you put your AIA number in when you registered. If not, you can shoot a note to Madison Young at AIA to get that fixed. And Kelly and I would like to thank you for joining us, encourage you to make 2030 happen at your firm, and encourage you to come out to our next COTE 2030 planning event, because the more people we have on our committee, the better work we can all do. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone, have a good rest of your afternoon.